What's up guys, this is a quick tutorial on how to make the HUD smaller so that it fits on the tables. There are three different ways we could go about doing this. First is to change the scaling settings. Second is to change the font size of the stats on the main HUD panel. And the third option is to split the HUD down into multiple panels. Let's take these options one at a time. First option, go into configuration, go to the HUD tab, have a look at this option where it says minimal HUD scaling percentage. This option sets a minimum size for the HUD panel as we reduce the size of the table. So make sure scale font sizes in HUD along with table size is turned on, then set the minimal HUD scaling percentage to 0. This will allow our HUD panels to become smaller and smaller along with the table. So it's recommended to experiment with this particular option first before trying any of the other options. So make sure these settings are saved. Click this save button in the top right. Fire up your poker client, set the tables to their current size, have a look at the HUD panel and see if it's an acceptable size. If it's still too big, then this is when we can perhaps try one of the other two options. So the two options is really going to depend on preference. We can either split the HUD down into multiple panels, or we can make the size of the font smaller on the HUD. So at this stage in the video, decide which of those two options seems to make the most sense for you and follow the relevant part of this tutorial. We have to start somewhere, so let's start with the font settings. To do this, we need to go into HUD Editor, select the version of the main HUD panel that we're using. Now you can see on the screen right now there is the option to select this multi-panel, so more on that shortly. Let's assume we're not using one of the multi-panel HUDs, we're actually just using the Tiderian shuttle, for example. So whichever HUD panel we use, we want to make sure we edit the correct panel. So if we are using the Tiderian shuttle and we edit the Death Star panel, then we're not going to see the change reflected on our tables. So let's imagine we're using the Tiderian shuttle. We select that from the drop-down box. Next step is to change the size of the font on these HUD stats. Now, unfortunately, while this sounds easy, it's not quite that straightforward. Ideally, we just select all of the stats at once and change the font size. Unfortunately, the functionality for that doesn't exist in Hand to Note. What we have to do is change each color grouping individually. So unfortunately, changing the font size is probably going to take about 10 minutes or so realistically. This is the procedure, and it's somewhat important we do everything in the right order, because if we do it in the wrong order, it's going to mess up some of the pop-ups and the coloring on the pop-ups, and we end up having to install the HUD from scratch. So we select one color grouping. We then select the color. Now it's important that we select the color first and not the font, because if we change the font first, it seems to edit some of the existing groupings. We select the font color. It should say custom, at which point we can change the size of the stats. For example, let's set it to size 8. I don't think we'd want it any smaller than that. We move on to the next color grouping. So we select the color first, looking for a dark cyan type color. Presumably the colors don't have to be exact, so any darkish blue color is going to be fine. If you wanted to change the HUD coloring of the panel anyway, this is how we'd go about doing it. So you can see those are all size 8 now. We'd move on to the bright yellow stats, which are the float bet stats. We'd select a bright yellow color. We change the size of the font to size 8. Hopefully we get the idea. So obviously we keep going until the entire panel is the appropriate font size. One final tweak we can make here is to disable this option, display as table in HUD. So the idea behind this option is it displays the data neatly in rows and columns, but that means there's additional spacing that we don't need for the sake of neatness. If we uncheck this option, then the numbers will appear in the smallest amount of space possible. Now, if we're not interested in changing the fonts, we simply need a better layout for the HUD. That's when the paneling option might make the most sense. So if we next go to configuration and we go to game types, you can see that different HUDs load up depending on the type of game that we're playing. This is also where we'd come if we want to switch between the Tiderian version of the HUD or the Death Star. Remember, the Tiderian version has stripped down pop-ups, so it's less likely to cause lag, whereas the Death Star has all of the information. So we can come here and by HUD, we can select multi-panel. Now, depending on which pop-ups we want, we'd either select Death Star multi-panel or Tiderian Shuttle multi-panel. I'm guessing for most of us, we're going to want to select the Tiderian Shuttle multi-panel because this is for play at the tables. This is going to mean that it's using the stripped-down version of the pop-ups, so it doesn't cause too much lag. We also need to select the pop-ups. So we obviously select the pop-ups that pertain to the main HUD panel we're using. So if we're using the Tiderian Shuttle, whether it's the multi-panel or not, the pop-ups we select should be the Tiderian Shuttle pop-ups. Now if we have a look at the table from a poker client, what we can see is that the HUD is split down into panels. So we now have a lot more flexibility regarding how we lay the HUD on the table. And what we have the option of doing is obviously putting one part of the panel above each of our opponent's avatars and then other parts of the panel below our opponent's avatars, i.e. the HUD doesn't just have to be in one block panel. We can tweak the layout so we can see all of the important table information, and we don't have to do stuff like constantly move the HUD panel to see what our opponent's hole cards are at showdown. The first time we load this multi-panel version of the HUD, it's possible the panels might be in a state of disarray, and we could lose track of which parts of the panel belong to the main part of the panel. For example, does this part of the panel belong to this player, or does it actually belong over here? And we've simply got it mixed up. In order to figure out whether the HUD panel does belong to the other HUD panels, we click on the top left stat, and we should be able to see the player's nickname there. We can confirm that this panel does belong to this main panel. Same for this particular panel. You can see the nickname of the player there. By clicking on the top left stat, we know that these three HUD panels belong together as part of one main HUD. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Using one or a combination of these three techniques, we should be able to get the layout to our liking. So just as a recap, number one, play around with the scaling options. Number two, edit the size of the fonts and also the colors if so inclined. And step number three, consider using a multi-panel layout. Alright, thanks very much for watching. Enjoy the Death Star HUD.